Hello everyone, welcome to the next part in our locomotive build here today. In the last part I believe we finished doing all of our touch-up painting here on the shell. As you can see there in the video, the scale coat paint has a bit of a glossy deal to it when it dries, so it looks a lot less matching than what it really is in person. It just kind of looks way too bright of a blue, but here in person it's much better of a match. But we went ahead and let that dry. We're going to go ahead and start on all of our DCC sound and lighting work here today. And this is kind of one of those parts of the build where you spend a lot of time waiting for glue to dry, and you try to work on different things to kind of keep moving along with the project as you go. So one of the first things I do when I start one of these DCC builds, as I mentioned in the original teardown of this, I always remove the weights just to give me more room to run wiring and everything in the shell, and so I don't have to worry about pinching wires and such. So with the weight being gone in the rear, we need to build a platform back in this area to mount our speaker to. And kind of the first part of that is going to be, I want to get my motherboard that I'm using here, this TCS AK-MB1. This is specifically for Atlas models, I believe, from TCS. These have a Keep Alive built in for them. I use these for all of the ESU Loc Sound V4 and Select Direct stuff. All the V5s you have to use that newer style ESU Keep Alive with. So these are what I use on these older builds. So what I start with here is I like to just basically get the board test fit where it's going to go. I'm not going to put it all the way on there yet, but I just want to get it test fit so I could see exactly what type of room I have here in the back to build my platform from to put the speaker on. And with that, normally I'll get my styrene. This piece is already cut, but all I do basically here is I kind of look here, and I don't want to touch that flywheel, but at the same time I don't want to be too far back here either, because then you start to interfere with the back of the shell. So normally I like to go between where the frame ends and this little screw bit that's coming up here, because then too, when you glue in your stand-up pieces there, it'll kind of stick against that and lock in really nice. So normally I just use scrap styrene that I have laying around. This is kind of a thicker variety here, so this will hold up really nice in there. It won't be flopping around or anything. And it's really important to try and make sure you cut this so that it fits inside the shell. I think this should be good. Oh yeah, that fits in there. But you always want to test fit it and make sure it'll fit in there. So the next part here, we have our basically our stand pieces here that go up. They'll support this. And this is another, I take scrap styrene, and what I do is I try to measure it so that hopefully that'll show up decent there. But so that it'll stand up above this gear tower. That's basically what I'm going for there. So that way, even if it does sag down a little bit, it won't interfere with the gear tower or any part of the drivetrain with this. So I just go ahead and I cut out 3 pieces, and I'll glue them in here. I'll just go ahead and do this real quick so you guys can see how this is, what I do about this. Get a little CA glue going. Yeah, get some of that out of the bottle. And pretty much just try and glue them where you think they're gonna go here. It's pretty self-explanatory, but you know. So we got our glue on the end there, and what we're gonna do is we're just gonna kind of try and set this right up against this piece that's sticking up here, so that we'll end up, it should, when it dries, dry up against that edge, and it'll be nice and solid there on that end. So try to have it centered, but you know, it's kind of one of those deals. It's on the inside of the shell, so it doesn't have to be perfectly centered and perfectly everything. So for the next one, there's these little holes here that go down into the frame. That's where the original weight's mounted at. So when you're when you're building these stands like this in here, you want to make sure you stay in the area where the weight used to be, because let me get something to point with here. This all right here is where the sill of the shell will sit at. This raised up part is where the weight used to be. So anywhere the weight was, you're good to be able to put something there. And the other kind of tricky part is you want to make sure that you try and have these stand somewhat straight up but leaned in. So again, I got a little glue on there. I'll go ahead and I'll wipe that down that edge. Oop, it's gonna fall over on me. But what I like to try and do here is those little holes that are down in there, I'll try to kind of get this piece to sit on there. And I use this very tacky CA glue. And normally it takes like a minute or so to set up, but once it sets up, they'll stand there on their own. It's just a matter of you have to wait for it a bit. But again, just a little bit of a bow in, just to kind of try and keep it from falling anyway. But there you guys can kind of tell there a little bit. And I guess got to do the same thing with the other side here. You can also do this with the front as well if you're worried about wires getting down into any of the drivetrain there. But I'll show you guys when I get the wiring part how I go about that. I just try to keep the wiring taped up and neat so it doesn't fall down there at all. Trying to build these up in the front can be a bit tricky because you have everything under the cab area. It's a little bit harder to fit something in there. But you just got to get that to sit there. Alright, and what we're going to do is we're just going to very carefully move that to the side and try and let that dry, because that's probably going to take about at least an hour for that glue to really set up before I'm going to want to install this top piece. But while we're waiting, one of the things we could do while we wait for our glue to dry is we're going to actually drill our holes for the truck power wires to go through on that. I like to run the wires underneath that piece, and then they'll pop up right before the flywheel. That kind of keeps them a little bit more neat and from getting caught in the drive shafts or anything there, or rubbing on the flywheel or any of that. So we'll get out our finger drill again, and we'll just go ahead and right towards the middle, we're just going to drill 2 holes, one for each side's wire, but pretty close to the front. Doesn't have to be exactly at the front, but I like to keep them nice and close to the front, so that way they hopefully it'll kind of keep them a little more tame and out of the way. That's kind of the goal there. Just drill that out, kind of get that drilled around a little bit, get all that flash off of there. Alright, so that's now ready to go. So we'll just set those stuff off to the side there. One of the next little bits we got to do here is we got to get our cab ready for the, well actually, you know what, we'll get the number boards ready next, because that's another fun part in and of itself, is doing our separate number boards from the headlights, because these Atlas models come with number boards and headlights that are all one unit. So we're going to start off here by, we'll start by doing the front headlights first and kind of show you all how this goes here. But basically what we're going to do is we have our housing we pulled out earlier, that the whole light deal. We're going to take our pair of pliers, and there's an edge right there. I don't know if how well that's going to show up on the camera, but it's right there. And I want to line my pliers up with that edge. Okay? Now, it's very important when you do this, you want to kind of try and cup it, because that little part will go flying if you're not careful. So you just got to kind of pop it off. And what you'll end up with is your little separate number board piece. Okay? You do that for both of the front ones, and then the rear one you have to do a lot of trimming too as well, just to get it to come out. But this can be a bit tricky to do. As I mentioned, these tend to go flying if you're not careful, so you want to be careful not to pinch your hand when you're doing this, but you also don't want to be chasing this thing around the house trying to find it, because they get airborne. So what you're left with is this from your headlight deal. This is scrap. Just throw it in the trash. No, it ain't any good. We're not going to need it for anything. Now for these rear ones, these are a whole nother animal, because we need to remove these side pieces here. So we'll go in with our pliers. Try to cut that off. Probably not. Well, we'll just break it off. Break those 2 sides off, and then we're going to come in and we're going to do the same thing as we kind of did with the front one, only we're trying to remove this main headlight shaft here. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this on camera or not, but we'll try. Oop. And there you guys can hear why I don't like, why you got to be kind of careful with that. I heard it go flying. Now I got to find it. Let's see, where in the world did that go? I got that. Where the heck did the big chunk of it go? I'll report back here in a minute when I find that big chunk. Alright, so I located our big chunk piece here. Alright, so we have this front part of this is gone. With these, I like to take a little bit more off if I can. Try to kind of flatten this whole part out here. So I'm going to do the same thing as I just did hopefully without losing the whole thing everywhere. And you just kind of keep working at this until it is fairly flat. See, that's not too bad. It's a little chunkier than I'd like, but that isn't too bad. Now the other thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to try and separate this into a smaller piece than this large chunk. So here we go again. Alright, there we go. There's that rear chunk. So what we end up with is all these little pieces that we didn't need. And we end up with just this little bit here that's going to be our rear number boards. And what I like about this is it has this little nub spot here. That's where we'll glue our LED in at. But we still have to clean our old numbers off of this number board housing. So what this is one of those, I've done it with alcohol before, the rubbing, 91% rubbing alcohol. I've done it a few different ways. Generally the least BS way is a little bit of sandpaper because you can just clean it right off. Because these number boards are pretty thin, but you end up sanding your finger and your fingernail a little bit, but that's okay. Let's just get this off of there. I mean, just a little bit there, it's already coming off pretty good, so these are pretty easy to get apart. I think another way you could do this as well is you could take your X-Acto knife, and if you have like a more dull blade, you could actually scrape this off. Forgot about that one. That also works. But the sanding works pretty good as well, so I just normally try to get it cleaned off pretty good here. But this could be it's always these like ends always seem to be a pain in the rear end. You always get that one little spot. It never wants to come off. Alright, let's get our blade out. Where'd that go? There it is. And just kind of take and carefully scrape that. That should come off. Is that coming up on the camera? I hope it is. There we go. Alright, so then what we end up with is a number board that has nothing on it, on the front at least, at all. And that's ready to have the LED glued to it. So let me get these other ones prepared here. I'll do this one here, just showing you guys the kind of the scraping method. Just hold it down with one end of the finger and just kind of lightly press. You don't have to press that hard. But all you're doing is you're just scraping this number board decal deal off the front of this. Trying not to cut your finger while you're doing it. That's the goal. We don't want to cut our finger, but that's kind of part of the deal sometimes. Sometimes you slip and you make a mistake. That's the way she goes. Go ahead and get that cleaned up. This is obviously the harder end because you're going uphill on this thing and you're trying to hold it with the little side. This is one of those steps, it's up to you. If you want to do this before you cut these off of the part they're on, you can, but kind of doesn't matter. I'm going to do the same thing in the back here. I'm just going to do it off camera, so I'll come back when I get ready to mount the LEDs. Alright, we got our number boards all cleaned off now, as you can see. So for the next part here, this is a bit where it gets a bit tricky. What I like to do with these is I try to drill a little bit of a recess in the back side of these housings. Hopefully that's showing up. Let's see if I can get a little better in the shot here. So what I do is I take my drill bit and I just want to make a little spot in the back side of these number boards. I don't want to do it in the top and bottom because then they won't fit in the cab anymore, but I just want it on the back side so that way I can mount my LED in that little spot. It just makes for a better mounting when you have a little place that LED is going to go down there and sit in. And as I mentioned, with the rear ones, they already kind of have a little spot like that, but with these front ones, you don't really have much to work with. So I'm just going to go ahead and drill a little hole, nothing crazy, but just enough that that little LED is going to fit down in there. Oop. It's another one of those tricky points where you're trying to hold something down, but you're not trying to drill a hole in your finger. And good times, guys, good times. It's one thing about doing this type of work in these builds, you always end up cutting your finger or almost drilling a hole in your finger or something. You get kind of used to it. It's just kind of the way it goes. Now this little spot down in here, I'm just going to go ahead and drill just a little bit just for the heck of it, just to give a little bit more of a spot. Because what I want to do is I'm gonna kind of dip the LED in the CA glue, and then what I hope happens is that when I put the LED down in that spot, it'll really stick in that little bit of a hole once it's dry with the CA glue. So what I have here are some LEDs. These are 402 warm white LEDs. Now, when it comes to LEDs, there's different manufacturers that make them. There's all this and that about them. I personally just get mine on eBay. I try to find whatever seller I can get the best deal. It's in the United States. I don't buy any of this stuff, direct from China, even though I'm fairly confident these are probably from China, but they're not from a seller in China where I'm going to be waiting 6 months to get them in. But I buy these ones I got, gosh, probably a year ago. I just bought a boatload of them because I always need them for projects. But the thing I like about these is this type of wire they have on them. I don't know what it is about it, but when you go to solder it, the insulation, if you heat it up with the iron, comes right off. Very easy to work with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dunk that LED in the CA glue. And then I'm going to take and I'm going to try and put it in that little spot down there. And I'm going to let it try and sit there and let it set up for a minute. Hopefully that's going to set up. But basically, I want to let it sit like that. Now, this is one of those parts where you want to let this sit for probably 4 or 5 hours. So what I like to do is I kind of get them started, and then I move them off to the side where I can let them dry for a while. That can be a bit tricky, but hopefully they dry. And when I go to install them later, they should be well secured in place. I have had it happen before where I've set them off to the side to dry, went to put them in, and the LED fell right off. So that's part of the reason I started drilling that hole in the back side, so that way it would kind of give it somewhere good to sit in. But that's also to be noted, that's not a guarantee that it's going to work either. But hopefully it helps. That's kind of the thought behind it. Is it's just a little something extra to kind of help keep it in place. As you can see here, these do not like to stick at first. So this is kind of the most challenging part, is getting that thing to stick in there and stay in there, and getting it moved off out of the way on the workbench without that falling out of there, because they always fall out of there. But I'll show you guys. I'm trying to show it here on the camera, just getting them put in there so you can at least see what that looks like. And once it's dry, I'll show this again, what they look like dried and finished. But I obviously have to wait for this to dry a bit first before that can happen. So, because you can't really handle them when they're not dry. So let's get that. Get that to sit in there. Alright, last one we're going to get on here. So I'll get this one installed. We'll go ahead and we'll dunk it in our CA glue again. Get a little bit of that on there. And we'll take it and we'll try and put in that little nib. I know that's probably not showing up too well on the camera, but I'll try to get a little better footage of this before I install it, so y'all can see exactly what this is looking like here. But this is one of those parts of the project where this is a last part you'd do at the end of the night, and you'd let this sit until you could work on it again the next day. Of course, in this video series, it's probably going to be like 10 minutes after this that we'll be installing them, but you know, that's the way video works. So I'm going to go ahead and get this one put off to the side here so I could film a little bit more. I'll be right back. Alright, so for one of our next steps here in our process, we're going to go ahead and we're going to want to get our cab windows back installed before we do any of our major wiring work. So what we have here, we have our front cab and our side cab. Now if you'll recall, we are doing this locomotive with open doors. So what that means is I have to remove windows from our cab set here. So you just take them and cut them. Not too much to it. What I'm going to do is I cut that one out. I'm going to flip over my cab here. And I'm going to go ahead and press this into place. Sometimes these pop right in, sometimes they don't like to. It just kind of varies depending on the day. But sometimes they'll go right into where they should be. And then if you want a little insurance that they're in there, you get out your plastic welder, and you just get a little bit of that in there to really knock it home and keep it well on the inside there. What I'll do is just get it a little bit down here in the middle, a little bit by this cab door, just kind of off along the edges. I don't want to get too carried away with this stuff because you all know how this plastic glue likes to remove paint. If you've ever used it before, it tends to do that quite a bit. So for the other cab windows here, this one we need to remove this back glass here. Well, actually we need to remove this entire side because we have an open window here and a back door here. So what I'm going to do with this part, I'm actually going to cut the whole side off of this. We'll just cut it right in the middle, right in the center. And what that's going to leave us with is our conductor side and back window on the conductor side. So we'll go ahead and we'll pop them in place. At least hopefully they'll pop in place. Hey, let's see how the luck goes today. There they are. So we got those in. And then what I'll do with this piece, since it has this large top section, I'll put the glue right up here in the top where you won't be able to see it from the outside or anything. But that has our cab pretty much ready to go now. One little thing I just noticed there is we're going to need to re-drill our holes for our headlight, because when we painted over that to keep the light bleed down, it looks like that paint kind of sealed up our holes. So we'll go ahead and we'll get our small drill bit out and we will clean those up real quick, because in the next part of this we'll start putting lights through these. Let's just go ahead and see if we can't find that spot in there. Where's that at? There it is. A lot of times you just got to move the drill bit around and you can kind of find where that hole was at. Sometimes it can be a little bit of a booger, but you got to kind of feel around a little bit and you'll find it. I don't really want to drill another hole because that's kind of the luck of the way it goes here. There it is. If you drill another hole, I've had those pieces come off before, and that's not a very good time. So, for the next part of this, we'll go ahead and we'll probably start doing the speaker assembly and building the back part for the speaker, getting that all ready to go, and start getting some of the wiring connected for the motherboard and all that to go ahead and get this thing put together. Alright, for our next part here, we're going to go ahead and build our speaker box assembly here. For speakers on models, I like to use these ESU little sugar cube speakers here. These are 5321s. I get 2 of them generally for each model I build. I just seem to get a better sound quality that way. But what you get with them is you get these little packs to build a speaker enclosure out of. Now, I tend to kind of modify these because the big thing with when you're adding sound to a locomotive is the bigger the speaker enclosure you can put in there, the better the sound's going to be. So with these, what I like to do is try to make the biggest one I could fit without messing with any of the wiring for the LEDs or anything. And that can vary from model to model how much space you have to work with. So there's your empty bags. I always hold on to these for spare parts bags when I pull apart locomotives and such, so I have a place to put all of screws, any little bits and pieces I might take off, like say wiper blades or something if I'm repainting a model, windows, whatever have you. Basically what I have here is I have our piece that's going to get mounted on the back, and then what I keep this around for is I like to use this as kind of a guide as to how much room I have to build my speaker enclosure. And what I'm going to do is I want to look through and try and figure out what I'm going to have room for as far as a base goes. Now, as we can kind of tell here, we don't quite have enough room. See if I move the camera back a little bit. We don't quite have enough room to fit both of these on here. So what I'm going to have to do is shorten this up a little bit. And what I'm going to do is basically I'll have speaker here and speaker here. This end part's not going to be here, and all of this middle part is an open sound chamber. So what I'm going to go ahead and do here is I'm going to take and I want to cut this straight and flush as I can. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to grab my chisel blade here, and I want to try and get this as close to perfectly flat as I can get it. So go right in between in the middle and just try and cut it. And hopefully that'll be fairly straight. It might not be perfect, but we'll see what we get here. Yeah, see, we got a little bit of a dent there, but I think we can work that out. We'll just kind of shave off a little bit more to get what we're looking for. So we'll use the plastic welder when we put this together to kind of try and blend it together a little bit better. And that came out a little no good. Let's see what this side's looking like. So there we go. If I could just get this center part off, get the center part flat. There we can see, that's what I like right there. Okay. So now we'll take our other base piece we have laying around here. And what I need to do, I like to have these sound chambers as open as possible, okay? So in doing that, I need to remove this edge piece here because we're going to be adding to the end of it. So I get our chisel blade in there nice and easy and kind of start working this off of here a little bit at a time. Just kind of working it away. So that way we'll have a nice open sound chamber. They'll really let the sound kind of build and work in. When you try to have the sound in a little place, like say in a switcher locomotive, a lot of times you don't have much room. That can cost you a lot of sound quality. So when working on like a GP38 like this, or even like any of the big SD locomotives, like say you're doing an Athearn model or something, you want to put as much speaker as you can possibly fit. That's kind of the secret to good sound with a locomotive. Alright, so we have that kind of put together there. That's going to work out nicely. It's not going to be a perfect fit, but when we use the plastic welder, it should go together nice. So, with that all figured there, what we're going to have to do here is we're going to now have to make our, oh gosh, what am I thinking of here? Our center part of our enclosure. We're going to have to try and glue this all together here, but what I want to do is I want to get these base pieces put into where they're supposed to go. So what I'll do is I'll take, I think I put those like that, and I put this one in the middle maybe. I'm trying to remember how I did this on the last one I did here. I just did one a couple weeks ago. I believe did I put them like that? Oh, let me get my extra parts here. This is another portion of the project where it's always good to keep your spare parts. And I have a whole bag of these little bits for building these, so I can really kind of root around and find what I need as far as different pieces. For quite a while, I used to not use the really thin shim pieces on these, so I have a bunch of them laying around that I can utilize to make this enclosure how I'd like. So basically what I'm going to do here is I'm going to need 3 of these little ones here to go across the middle. I'm going to cut this entire middle segment out of it. And then I'll use these top pieces on each end with the speaker on top of them, and then this large piece will go in the middle with the cap on top of it. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to kind of work on this here. We're going to take and we're going to cut this middle part out of one side of this. And for this, I'll just grab the old pliers here again and just cut it right there and right there. So I'll leave us with that section there. We just take and set that right in there because that's how we want it. We're going to go ahead and get our glue, and we're just going to run it right along the inside here. We want it pretty good in there. I like to try and glue these from the inside if I can. It seems to make a better bond. And now we'll go ahead and we'll take our opposite end and we're going to cut out the opposite side. So again, just taking and cutting the one side of this out. The middle one's where it can be a bit tricky because that middle one, you don't have any, so you have to cut both sides off of it. So let's go ahead and get this to sit down in there like so. There we go. Alright, get that little piece of hanging up there. I don't want that hanging around like that. Alright, now we need to do our center one, which just flew at me. And what I'll do here is I'll take and I'll cut there. I'm going to cut there on the opposite side. And now is where it gets tricky because you got to get this to set in there. That could be a bit of a chore sometimes, but that actually went in pretty well for a change. You'll find that sometimes things go really well and sometimes they don't with doing projects like this. You could build these speaker enclosures 10 times over, and one time it goes perfect, another time it goes terrible. It just depends on how the world's turning that day, I suppose. Now with this middle one, once you get this section in here, it's generally a good idea to get the top one in before the glue's all the way dry on the bottom. And the reason I say that is if the center section isn't perfectly square, if you get that on there fairly quick, you're going to really lock that in place. And now I'll come back and hit this from the outside, as you guys can tell here, as opposed to just hitting it on the inside. Now we're getting a little bit closer, but basically what we've done here is you can see here we have this large area here where our sound can flow out of each speaker into this big middle chamber area, and you get really good quality sound when you have that, because basically this big center section will be unoccupied with anything. It'll all be in this end. So we'll go ahead and we're going to put our next small bases on each side. These ones we don't cut out anything for, but I think y'all get the idea there. We just by cutting out that one side on each one of those there, it really opens up the chamber quite a bit to give us a much better quality of sound. So get that glue on there. Do the same thing with this side. And what I like to try and assemble these separate, and then when this glue dries here pretty shortly, it doesn't take too long, then I'll glue the whole thing together, this extra piece to the main portion of this. We just gotta let that sit for a minute, but while we're waiting we could put this cap on here. This is just a cap to cover up this middle part where there won't be a speaker. And I want to note that, you know, this might not be the exact right way to build a sound chamber. It might not be the way that you choose, but it's just what I've found to work and sound good. And another kind of positive of doing it this way is with this center section being higher like this, when you put your speaker in there, it kind of gives you a little bit of room to where you don't have to worry about the wires getting knocked off of it easily. Alright, that's pretty well dried on. So now we got to glue this last part on there. So I'm just going to get a little heavy with our plastic cement, and then I just want to get that on there as quick as I can so that way it'll hopefully start to bond in place. Hopefully. Now this plastic cement stuff it's like a plastic, I think does something to the plastic, chemically speaking, where it kind of melts it in a way. So when you have a bit of a gap, you could kind of get away with just really laying this stuff on there and it'll kind of melt it and fill it in. It's called a plastic welder, so I don't know how accurate that is, but I've noticed that it does do the trick. It does it pretty good. So just be nice and heavy with that, because that's, obviously that's a separate piece and we want that to be well on there, not just a little bit on there. So then I'll come back and I'll hit this inner part a little bit too to really galvanize that joint there. I want no chance of that coming apart. I want that nice and well done, so to speak. So we'll just keep hitting that until it's completely good. If you can't even tell the pieces anymore, that'd probably be a good point to stop, but let's hit that on there nice. So now we just got to wait a minute for this to kind of dry up a little bit, and we'll go ahead and we'll mount our speakers next with a little CA glue. Once that finishes drying, should be a second here. While I'm waiting for that, I'll put away, when all's said and done, this is what I have left over from all those parts pieces, and as I mentioned, I used a few pieces from this. ESU also does make a, oh gosh, it's like a different kit that has all sorts of different bases that are supposed to just screw into models, but I'm not quite sure why. I've never had any luck with that one. I've had a lot of speakers issues whenever I've tried to use that one, so I tend to stick with these old-fashioned build-your-own base kind of deals, and these seem to really be the ticket, at least for me, when it comes to doing all the speaker building. So now what I'm going to do, I got my speakers, got my trusty CA glue over here still ready to go, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a little bit here on my toothpick, and I just want to get this edge here. I don't want to get too carried away now, because I don't want to get any glue on the front of the speaker, but I want to glue the speaker to the enclosure. So I just rub it on that edge and try to set it right in its spot. I don't want it to be moving around at all or anything like that. I want it to be right in its spot there. Get a little bit more CA glue on that old trusty toothpick. Let's go ahead and wipe that all around there. And we'll get our speaker mounted in there. We set our speaker on, and much like the lights and everything, this will dry out here pretty good, but what we're left with is this nice little brick here that'll be our sound chamber and speaker setup here. Not pretty, but it's going to get the job done, and that's what's important. It's going to give us good sound, and that's really all I could ask for at the end of the day. So I think this might be dry enough. Well, let's take a quick peek here and see how dry we are with our back portion here. See if we can maybe get this glued in place while I got the camera running. That might work. I think we'll be able to. Yeah, let's go ahead and let's start gluing this on. So for this back portion here, we're going to feed our wires through our holes that we drilled earlier. And these wires will obviously be trimmed down once we start doing the wiring, but for now I like to leave them long. I don't like to cut anything until I'm doing all the final wiring work, so I just leave everything as long as it possibly can be, and then I'll handle cutting it down however much it so needs to when I get to that point. But all I do is put that on there like so. As you can see, we got a little bit of room underneath it, but not a boatload. It's a little bit tall. Well, it might be a little taller than I care for. I don't know. This is also a really good point to check. We'll just set that on there. We set our speaker on here, and then we'll take our shell and bring it over and make sure that that's not going to be sitting too high. No, it won't be all right. What you basically do is you check, and you put the shell down next to it. It's going to sit a little bit lower than what it will when it's mounted on the sill. But make sure that this speaker isn't sitting up too high on the side like it isn't up here towards the top. It should be down somewhere in this radiator area. So we'll have enough room, so we'll be good to go there. So I'll go ahead and start gluing this in. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just get more of our favorite plastic welder and just start slathering it in spots and trying to kind of put this stuff in place. This can be one of those tricky parts where trying to glue this is a bit of a hassle, but you just got to kind of find ways to hold it and get the cement in there without moving it too much, without cementing your finger to the styrene either. Yep, go ahead and get that on there. Now we'll just let that kind of look at it and make sure it's somewhat centered from side to side. Doesn't have to be 100% perfect, because you always want to make that a little bit smaller, but at the same time you want to have it somewhat close. Now, as you can see here, somebody didn't cut their riser pieces here perfectly square, so we'll go ahead and get a little heavy with our cement here and just make sure that's really well on there. The same, other side's nice and square, back's pretty square. Go ahead and hit that again. Alright, so now what we gotta do is we're still waiting on our parts to dry from our number boards. We still gotta wait for those to dry. So I can't really dive into putting the LEDs in just yet, but once that's all dry here, I'll come back and start filming again. We'll get our LEDs put in and prepare to start doing all the wiring work. Alright, so we're back here at the workbench. We have our number boards are all glued together here with the LED on the back side of them there. That glue's finally dried. So what we're going to start today is we're going to go ahead and we're going to start putting some of our LED lights in. I think I mentioned in the last part I use 402s and 603s and just the ones you get on eBay for cheap. Nothing too fancy. But for the headlight and rear light, I use this 603. They're a little bit bigger, but I feel like they're a little bit brighter for the headlights. And the ditch lights, I use the 402s because they're a little bit smaller and they fit in the housing better. But basically, if I get that to focus, so there's your LED pre-wired there. What I like to do is I take this and I just kind of turn it a little bit. And what that does, that kind of helps the LED stand up and face out. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take our wires and we're going to feed them through the headlight housing here. So I always like to start with the bottom one. Well, it would be the top one on the Locomotive here, but it's the bottom one we're looking at. We're going to go ahead and we're just going to try and feed that through. Now this can be a bit of a pain because you got to try and fish them through that little hole you drilled in that back there. And these little wires can really be a pain in the rear end. Sometimes what you got to do is you got to take them and just put a little twist on them. And then you just go in there and you kind of fish it around until it goes through. And like everything else on this build, you guys are going to watch me struggle with it because, of course, we're recording it. So that way when you're sitting at home, if you're trying to do this as well, you can say, you know what? Even Steve had trouble with this. It's just the way these can be sometimes. Just trying to find where... Oh, nope. Now where is... Okay, so it's more off the bottom a little bit. It's just fishing around. Now you could make the holes a little bit bigger so this isn't such a pain in the rear end. But you'll end up with light bleed if you're not careful with that, as well as you can also end up with a hole that's big enough that the LED will slip through it. So I tend to kind of stick with a smaller hole just to make it a little bit, just to try and avoid some hassle if I can. It might take a minute or two to fish them lights through, but that's the price you got to pay to have to avoid other issues. So what I do is normally I'll pull them through to about there, and I just very gently pull them in the rest of the way. I don't want to pull too hard because I can rip them wires off, but I just want to get that LED inside the headlight there, because we'll make a lens to go over the top of that later. I don't want to pull it all the way back down and in though, to where it's disappeared in there. So we got the first one, then let's go ahead and knock the second one in. Same process, just put a little bend on the end of that there. Nothing too crazy because you don't want to break the LED off the wires. But Now we gotta do the old fishing deal here. If I can get it to work, we're gonna get it fished through. There we go. And that's a perfect example there. Sometimes these will go really easy, and sometimes you'll fight with them. It just depends. Depends on the day, the weather, the way you're feeling. It's, you know, if you're having a rough day, I pretty much can guarantee you're going to fight that first LED, but go ahead and kind of want to get that turned so it's facing right, and then just pull it in. Alright, so those are just barely inside the front there, as you guys can see. They're not standing up and down perfectly straight, but that's fine. We just need them to be pointed most of the way out. The lens will help kind of straighten that out a bit. So the next thing I'm going to do here is, this is Kaplan tape, or it's some kind of tape. I got it from, it's TCS, the people that make the sound and the decoders and everything. But this is a tape that you'll find inside like an Athearn locomotive, etc., holding down wires and stuff. This is actually it's electrical kind of tape, but it's not electrical tape. I'm not an expert in all the jargon with this stuff, but what I'll do is I'll take a little piece of it, and I'm just going to use it just to hold down the LEDs here. So there's our little piece we cut off, and we're just going to take, and I normally like to try and have these centered as much as possible. We'll just tape it down like so. Leave a little bit of slack in here. I don't want to leave too much, but just enough that if that gets pushed down, it won't pull the wire through. Alright, so there's that. And then the last thing I do here, because we're going to put all of the LEDs in before we start wiring the LEDs to the board, I'll take a piece of masking tape. What I'm going to do, there goes that flying everywhere. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the end of my wires here. I'm going to take my piece of masking tape, and I'm just going to take and put it so that all these wires are together, okay? And the reason you want to do that is when you go to start soldering all this up, it's kind of handy to know what everything is. So when you put the lights in, when you put the LEDs in like this, you can just tape off the end, and then you mark it accordingly. This will be the headlight, so we'll just put FL for front light, like so. And that way when I'm going through and I'm putting all this on the board, I can further, I can find things a lot easier, I suppose would be the best way to put that. Won't be as much of a hassle. But next we're going to go ahead and we're going to do our number boards. These are pretty much the same kind of process. These will be a little bit tricky because these don't have the separate cab area like a lot of like an Atlas GP38 has, or an SD35. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to try and get these to go in there. Once we get them to sit in there, we got to try to glue them in place with a little bit of or the scale bond plastic welder. Not a lot though, because I don't want to soak the LED and I don't want to ruin the paint. So go ahead and start fishing these through. Patience is a big thing with this part of the project because these little wires will drive you absolutely crazy. But it's one of them things where when the project's done and you can have all the separate lighting and everything, to me it's really worth it. Even if I kind of rip my hair out a little bit working on these parts here, it's just the price you got to pay to have something cool. So we'll go ahead and we'll get that almost pulled in there. We're just going to very carefully kind of try to slide this into where it should be. Now we got it where it's sitting back a little bit. That's not where I want it at, so I'm going to take and push it back out from the back side. What I'll do is I'll get a little bit of our scale bond here, and we're just going to put it right around the edges here, just right inside there, because I don't want to glue these all the way in, but I'd like to have them stay in place. And you just want them a little bit glued. You don't want them all the way glued, because if you ever have a problem and you have to rip this all out of here, you don't want to destroy a finished model later on down the road if you do run into an issue. But So that's all now flush, and I'm just going to be careful not to pull on that, because that, like I mentioned, that's on there pretty dang good, but it is, you know, going to be a little bit loose. You're just going to have that. That's unfortunately the way that goes, but we'll go ahead and get the other one thrown in here real quick and tape down. And what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and I'll do the lights on the same thing with the rear lights, and then we'll jump back when we get to like the marker lights and running all that stuff. So this video isn't like, this whole series is going to be pretty long as it is. And if I could cut out some of the more repetitive things, I'd kind of want to do that. Not to mention, I've been having trouble with just getting the longer videos off my phone. That's been a bit of a hassle. For those of you that don't know, I record the majority of my YouTube stuff with my cell phone. So kind of limited as to the video and camera quality, but it's just kind of been the best way I've had to do it until recently. I got a one of those GoPro camera deals. Those are pretty. I'm really liking that, and I'm really liking how the Conrail and HO scale videos are coming out with it. But I started this series with the phone camera, and I intend to finish it with it. So we're just gonna get a little bit on the edges there. That should hold it right where we want it at. At least hope that's the idea. Hopefully it'll hold it where it's supposed to be. Hopefully I can just kind of move these. Yeah, that's in there good. Okay, so we're gonna get the tape again. Our favorite tape, our yellow fancy electrical tape here. And all I'm using is I'm just putting it down the edge of the workbench. I'm using the knife to cut it off a decent length there. Because this stuff's pretty sticky. It's not terribly tacky, but it also, you know, you could put it down on something and pick it up and put it back down again if need be, without it losing too much of the adhesion or anything that it's got going on. So there we have it. There's just our tape just in there. I mean, it's nothing too fancy, nothing crazy, just tape holding down stuff. We'll go ahead and we'll put our masking tape on our wires. Oh yeah, we got the old rat's nest going already. This is one of the probably the hardest parts of the wiring. I think the soldering's easier than this, is just trying to keep all the dang wires straight. When we get a little bit further along, I'll probably end up twisting a lot of these wires together, but this early in the project, just feeding wires through and stuff, I don't like to get too carried away with twisting things up, because it kind of can make things a little bit more challenging. And then too, later on, I like to kind of, all the red wires, I like to put all those together, etc. So it's kind of hard to do that when you have them all twisted together. Just throw our tape on. We'll put our, go ahead and label this one NB for number board. And this obviously, unless you want to have separate front and rear number boards, you don't have to label the front and rear. Just label, you know. Just label number board NB, nice and simple. Now the last kind of step with this here, you're probably wondering, well, there's no backing on those number board lights, so you know, how are you going to keep light bleed out of the cab? And that's where our electrical tape comes in. And we'll take a piece of this and we'll kind of use it to cover up the backside, because it is black tape. And it should, that'll work. It's kind of tricky because you want to get a big enough piece that it fits here, but you don't want to have so much so that you're gonna cover up half the cab. But that's just kind of the way this works here sometimes. We got to kind of fish it in here, and the trick is you want to get it up underneath this front ledge if you can. Sometimes that could be a bit of a bear. See, like right there, yeah, we got a little bit too much down here. I might have to cut that back a little bit. Make that a little bit shorter. Grab our knife and cut that down. But basically we're going to use the tape to cover up our number boards from the back side here on the inside of the cab. And it's just kind of tricky because you want to get it you want to get it above the window, but sitting back, and that can be kind of a pain in the rear end. Well, see, we got a little bit of coverage there, but nothing like what I'd like. I'm going to need more than that, so we're just going to get another piece of tape. This is the part where you just keep putting tape at it till you get it covered up to where you need to be. Because I don't want to cover up my windows. Really don't want to do that. But I got to have it right there to block the light from the number boards. Oh, I shouldn't have pulled that up. Oh, that's better. But I think you guys can kind of see there. There's where it's right at the edge of that window. I need one more piece to cover up the other side. And then this will be good to go, ready to put on the rest of the shell once I get the LEDs installed in that. As I just mentioned probably 2 minutes ago in this video, I'll go ahead and I'm going to cut the camera off once I get this last piece of tape in here and give you guys one last show of it. And I'll go ahead and put the lights in the back and just we'll kind of zoom along a little bit there. And that went a little higher than I wanted. Hey, there's another piece of tape. That'll work. There we go, right on the edge of it there. So you can't see it from outside the cab. You need a little bit, but it covers up all of our light gap there so we won't have light bleed, and that's really what's important there. So there is our finished cab with lights installed, ready to rock and roll. So we'll go ahead and we'll set that off to the side for now. And I'm going to go ahead and start doing the lights on the rest of this here, and I'll get back to you when I start doing the marker lights and the ditch lights. Alright, so far we have our rear headlights installed there, as well as our number boards. Rear lights are in, and then on the inside here, all we did was we taped right back here at the rear, and right up here about midway up. That way the wires don't fall down and sit on the speaker and create an annoying noise. So our next step here, one thing I forgot to do earlier, but after we glued our plow in, way back in the detailing phase, we have these ends that are sticking off the plow. So we get our old track cutters out, the ones that are just for cutting stuff off. We want to trim them nibs off the end there. And the reason for that is when we go to put the shell on later, those can bind up and really end up being a pain in the rear end when you're trying to get the shell on. So we're just going to take and just try and cut those as flush as we can. There's a little bit of slop there. We don't need to worry about it being perfectly flush, but just getting the end off of them so they go on there easier. And another little thing I forgot to do earlier was up here in the front, we have no way to get from our marker lights and our ditch lights through to back here without going through this area right here, which you could do. Personally, myself, I don't care to see the wires going through the cab, but it's kind of a necessary evil because I would rather run them up on the inside of the short hood here and then on the floor of the cab here up to the top and have them away from all of the motor and drive area than risk putting them taped up on the bottom and then running into a problem down the road where they end up getting hung up in the motor and drive, well, in the drive line, drive shaft. So I'm just going to take my good old-fashioned finger drill again. I'll tell you right now, guys, you want to do any sort of building like this, one of these is a must. These are so handy. And then just a cheap set of drill bits from Harbor Freight with all different sizes in them, especially the smaller ones. You can do a lot of stuff with these. They're very, very handy. Very handy. And just get that kind of out. So just put the hole right there against that back wall. You got to take and blow all the little bits and pieces off there, but there's our hole. That's what we're going to feed all our wiring through. I'm actually going to make a second one, and what I'll do is I'll have the marker lights ones will go through one hole, the ditch light ones will go through another. You can make one giant hole. It just, this is kind of the drill bit I grabbed, so we're going to do two. Or you can make one big one and feed them all through that. It's whichever you care to do. Doesn't matter. So now we're going to grab our marker lights here. And I'll do one. I'll cut the camera off and do the other, and then I'll come back when we get to doing the ditch lights because those are a bit tricky. All I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna do the same deal as I did with the cab. I'm going to try to fish them dang wires through that little tiny hole in there that you can't see. And this is a different type of LED because these are red. So these are a little bit more of a booger to get through. But just got to fish it around until it goes through there. Because it will at some point or another. Provided I re-drilled that hole. I better look at that. Did I ever? Oh, I didn't. That's our problem. Okay. I see what I did there. So when I did the black paint on the inside of this to keep the light from bleeding, you got to go back through and clean out your holes from where you originally drilled to feed the LED through, because sometimes that black paint will actually cover them up, and that would be what we had going on here. So we got to get our drill bit out, and that might be a little bit too big. I want to go with a smaller bit than that. Nah, that one looks good. Because these are the 402 LEDs, so these are, yeah, be a little bit more careful about how big of a hole you make to put the wires through, because these will slip through, and oh, that's very frustrating when that happens. Let's get that in there and just clean that out. Do the same thing on this one. All right, so now we should be good. Let's try that again. Let's try getting them lights through again. You can try and these type LEDs with this type of wire don't like to twist together as well as the other ones do, unfortunately. So this can really be a bit of a pain, but occasionally they just go right through like that. So go ahead and let them fall down there. And I want to do the same thing I did with the other LEDs, where I kind of put that little bit of a, let's see if that'll show up there, a little bit of that bend on it, that way it won't pull all the way through when I feed it through the shell here. And another little trick you can do is, once you get it started through the hole, before you pull it all the way through, just start feeding it through this one. And that way you won't have to have all this slack wire running around everywhere when you're trying to feed it around. So I'm just going to feed it all the way through to the rest of the shell here. Tweezers, they also another very important tool. We'll just go ahead and pull that through till it's sitting down in there. Just, right about there. What I'm going to do with these is I'm going to leave them sticking out just a little bit, because then when I push it down with the tape, then it'll sit down flush in there. And then also, so this is what I was talking about. You're going to have wires running through the cab, which kind of stinks, but it is what it is. Let me get this other one fed through, and I'll get it taped down, and I'll show you when we dive into the ditch lights. Alright, so we're back here now. We got our marker lights in on the front, as well as our marker lights in on the rear. Got our lights all taped down, and everything, as you guys can tell, is kind of starting to show up here in the middle, because this is where the decoder will be at on the chassis. So that's kind of where I want all my wires to end up being at. Right now, we're going to go ahead and we're going to dive into the ditch lights. So this is, I hope I can get this on video halfway decent. This might be a bit of a challenge. We'll see what we get here. But I'm hoping I could get this to come out decent. It just depends on how well this all works out here. I'm not quite sure just yet. But what we're going to do is we're going to take, and we already went ahead and we broke our ditch light casting off of this little odd piece that was holding on. I also went through and made sure I re-drilled my hole for the wiring to go through. I recommend drilling from the back side where the piece of styrene's sitting at. That way you're pushing down in. If you try to drill from the front, what will end up happening is the styrene's on there decent, but it's not very well on there. You're not going to get plastic to glue to this white metal stuff too well. So you kind of want to watch, because you can break those off, and that's that can be a bit frustrating, because then you're sitting there waiting for glue to dry again. And I'm hoping that when you guys watch this, you'll kind of get an idea that you could do bits and pieces as you go along here, but there are times you got to let glue dry, so you kind of got to jump around a little bit as you go here. So we're going to feed our LED wires through the housing here, through that little hole. And of course, that's going to be a pain, but hey, it's always easier to do them on these little castings than it is to do them on the actual shell. The wires always go through a lot easier, probably because you can move the casting around a little bit easier and stuff. But same technique as what we did on the headlights and all the other lights. We just put a little twist on the end so that way that light will point out. Okay? And it'll also keep it from pulling through. So now for the fun part. When I drilled out these holes for all this earlier, these castings, they'll move around a little bit. So what I gotta do is I gotta feed my wires through the holes I drilled for them, which should be right there, I believe. I know it's gonna be really hard for you guys to see that, but I'm kind of limited here because I gotta look right at the model. I can't do this through the camera. So we'll go ahead and we'll get those fed through. And what I like to do is I like to get them most of the way pulled through. Get them pretty close. We got to tighten up that blue wire a little bit. Pull that in there just a little bit more. And then we'll take, and I have some CA glue out over here. And if I could find my toothpick, I just had it, there it is. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take and I'm going to dab a little CA glue on the end of my toothpick here. And I'm going to go into where the hole's at for the ditch light. And I'm just going to get that in and around there pretty good. If I get a little on the LED wires, that's fine. Doesn't really matter. Now I'll go ahead and I got to try and fish that light in here. Try and get the LED and everything to sit in the hole, but this is another one of them parts where you can end up fighting with it for a few minutes, but it also is a little bit easier when you're not trying to film it to do this. So I got one eye on my camera here, one eye on the screen of my phone here, and another eye on what I'm trying to do. Let's see if we can get that started at least. I believe that might be it. Yep, that's it. Okay, let me get them wires pulled through here. I believe that might be it. You just pull your LED through flush. Now the tricky part here is these castings can move around a little bit. At least generally they tend to, so we're just going to kind of let that sit and we're going to let it dry a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and throw the other one in. But we're going to let these ditch lights kind of dry in place before we dive too far into doing anything else. Because I've had it before where if you're working on another part of the shell, the wires will move the ditch light casting around, and then they won't be straight and square. And I think we about got that right where we want it there. So let me go ahead and dive through the rest of this front here, and I'll come back to you when we start taping down the wires for it and doing everything for the getting the motor and drive chassis ready to go. Alright, so we have our front and rear ditch lights installed now. Got them glued in place. And we have all of our wiring is all taped up and in place here. Now for like these rear ditch lights, I'll tape it along this back rear end of the hood. Once there, and then once there. And then the front, it's a similar kind of thing. Inside the short hood, inside the hood, we run through our holes and then we tape them down right there. So our next kind of piece in this puzzle here is going to be, we're going to feed our lights through for our cab, and we're also going to be gluing our cab on. With this, the trickier part's kind of that we have these little pieces of tape we made, which can be a bit of a booger to get through our hole here in the front of this cab because of the wires we already have in there. But it's still easier to do this way than to try and feed all of the ditch light wires and stuff through with the cab on there. So I always do the cab last. So we just got to get them started through there, and then we pull them the rest of the way through. Hopefully we don't hook any of these other wires when we're pulling them through, but you never know how it's going to go. Go ahead, there we go. Try not to get them all tangled up, but that can be easier said than done sometimes. So now what I'm going to do, these cabs are held on generally by these corner spots. With our doors being cut away, some of those are kind of missing there. So what I'm going to do, there's these little nibs here on the side. I'm just going to put just a little bit of CA glue on those, not a lot. I just want this piece, this little part sticking up there to sit in there and hold it in place. I don't want it to be a permanent forever bond, because if I ever have to get in here to work on the lights, I would like to be able to get this apart without destroying it, but I also don't want the cab falling off all the time either. So if you glue that, you should be alright for anything in the future having to get in there and not having too much trouble. The thing about these cabs, once you remove the doors, is they are a bit on the loose side, so they won't want to fit very tightly on there anymore. But normally they just snap in place, as they always have. And then in the future, if you need to get in to work on anything, you could take your knife and just work it apart as you did when you took it apart originally. So I'm going to go ahead and I want to set this off to the side to let the glue dry. You can see we have all our light wires hanging everywhere. We're going to go ahead and we're going to dive into our motor and drive assembly next, and starting to prepare this for all the lighting and everything. Alright, so we got our motor and drive assembly back out here. Last time we had this out, I believe you recall, we did the platform back here for our speaker to sit on. So this is all good and dried now. It's fairly sturdy. I mean, if you really started ripping on it, you could knock it off, but that CA glue will make a good bond there and make a good place for this to sit at. That's solid and won't rattle around or anything. Right now I got the soldering iron warmed up, and for anyone that's curious, this is just your basic Harbor Freight cheapo. They're like 10, 12 bucks soldering iron I've been using for the last few years. Nothing fancy. And I use this Kester brand solder. 60% tin, 40% lead. Been using this since I used to do a lot of work on guitars back when I played music more. And this stuff just really seems to bond well, and it seems to just bond everything together really nice. I don't have any trouble with it. Now, first little bit I'm going to do here is with Atlas and then Athearn. Even sometimes you'll have problems with these wires, or excuse me, Kato. You'll have problems with the wire on the side of the motor hanging out and catching on the shell when you go to put it on. So all I like to do is just put a piece of electrical tape there just to hold that wire up and out of the way and keep it from catching when we go to install the board here. Because for the board installation on an Atlas like this, it's generally pretty simple. You just put it over top of the holes and it'll pop right in place. And then all we have to do is solder our wires on. So let me see if this iron's good and hot enough yet. Oh, this is going to be fun. Trying to solder around a phone. Let's see if we can get a little heat on there. Ooh, yeah, we're good. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, and what I like to do when I'm starting a new wiring project on a model like this, is I just go through and I hit all the pads and get a little solder on them to start with. That way when I go back to do all the individual lights and wires, they already have something on there, so all I have to do is prepare the wires, and I'm not sitting there trying to melt anything onto the board any more than I have to. It's just easier to do it now. Iron's not quite hot enough yet, but it's warm enough to start melting this stuff. Once these irons get to be hot, they'll really melt this stuff quick. And one thing to note about this, for anyone wondering, it's pretty likely you'll burn your finger at some point or another. You're just going to bump the iron, or when you're holding the wires, etc., they'll get a little bit on the hotter side, but you just got to be careful. Don't grab the iron or anything, not too smart, but if you burn your finger a little bit, it'll heal, you'll be okay. It's just kind of the name of the game with some of this stuff. Sometimes you end up doing something stupid with it, and you don't want to, but that's part of learning how to do all this wiring and stuff. Especially with all these little wires and tight spaces, it's really easy to do that. But again, for anyone wondering, I mean, it hurts, but it doesn't hurt that bad. I could think of pain that's a lot worse than that, so just kind of keep working our way across here. I'll go ahead and do these back ones, and I'll come back to you when I'm ready to start putting the wires on. Alright, so we've got a little bit of solder on all of our pads, and we're ready to go ahead and start doing some of our wires here. Now, I like to kind of trim the wires to be close to a good fit, but I don't want them exact to where if they're too short I could be in trouble. So with this one here, what I like to do is kind of just pull it over the edge and see, and then I'll go a little bit longer than I need to, about like that. That way I've got a little bit of play and a little bit of leeway for if I run into trouble with this. I could always kind of stuff the wire back underneath the board if need be. Now, for this, what you're going to want to do is if you try to strip this wire with a wire stripper, I'm sure somebody in the comments will say, oh, I do that all the time, but I've had a lot of trouble doing that, and I've broke a lot of wires, I've ripped wires off and all that. So what I choose to do is I'll just take and I'll heat the insulation up on the wire like so. And then normally if you heat it up like that, it'll kind of burn it, and you can actually just pull off the end of the insulation with your fingernail. And then we'll come back and we'll put a little bit of solder on it to get burnt all the way in, although it's already getting a little bit on it just from the tip of the iron right now. Not the prettiest method by any means, but what I've found to work best at least. Let's see if we can get that solder on there now. Ooh, that wire got nice and hot there. This is where you'll kind of get a little bit of burn on the fingers, is when you're trying to hold a wire and solder the end of it. Unfortunately, that's part of the game. That's just going to be part of what it is when you're trying to do this type of work. Again, though, I mean, if any of you at home are watching and doing this, you'll see what I mean. It's a little painful, but it's nothing too bad. Although I would advise when you're doing like these ends here, you may want to use an iron to get them better in place there, or use a pair of tweezers. That's what the word I'm looking for. They're tweezers. Ooh, that ain't gonna want to sit there. Oh, nope, there it goes. So there we have that one. Gotta get that down in there. That looks like that's burned all the way in. This is kind of the tricky part, just making sure you get everything all the way soldered, because you don't want this stuff without a good connection. So that don't look too bad. I don't think that's going anywhere. No, that's on there. Same thing with this side. Just come in and burn the old insulation off. Don't worry about hitting the board or anything. You'll do that from time to time working on this stuff, or other wires, because these ones still have to be trimmed down yet. Go ahead and yank that insulation off the end. So, yeah, it's not wanting to come off. There we go. And we'll just go ahead and let that iron sit on there for a minute, and then we'll start putting some solder to it. Sometimes you got to let the iron sit there for a minute, or else that the solder won't want to flow onto the wire. So generally helps if you just let that get a little. You want the wire to be as hot as the soldering iron, but you do and you don't. You do because you want it to, the solder to go on it, but you don't because that's normally about when you start feeling your finger burning. And again, we're just going to kind of come in here, and this is one of them little tricky deals, but this is again where you can leave more wire if you want to, or less. I kind of go in the middle here. Although if you really wanted to, you could leave these full-length wires, and this would probably go a little bit easier. I just don't like stuffing wires around any more than I have to. But there's that one. That's held in there now. Again, not the prettiest solder joint, but you don't have to be pretty to be on there well and make a good connection. You just got to be on there well and making a good connection. So what we're going to go ahead and do next, we're going to do these front and rear wires for the trucks. What I do with these is similar to the motor wires. I'll kind of take them and I eyeball them a little bit long, about, let's see if that goes up and over. Yeah, we'll go about there. That ought to work. Again, this is a very much by eye kind of thing. You could have as much or as little as you want. I try to go in the middle with it. I don't want to cut them way too short, but I also would prefer they not be too long, because that's when you run into issues with them getting warped, getting wrapped up in the drive shaft, etc. So I'll go ahead and do these I'll do this first front one, and then I'll do the rear ones off camera, so we could save a little bit more time on our tutorial here. And then I'll come back when we start doing the speaker wiring. It's all that'll be our next little bit on this, will be the speaker wires and installing the speaker as well on our platform we made earlier. So I'll be looking forward to that. I'll be done here shortly. There we go. There's that. Oh, nope. Nope, didn't want to. And sometimes you just got to hold that in place to get it to stick right. But there we go. See how we can kind of pick up on that with it? That means that's a good connection. So let me go ahead and get this other one done. I'll do these back ones, and then I'll come back when I get into doing the speaker wires. Alright, so we got all of our wires in here on our chassis for the front and rear trucks, as well as for the motor. Now it's time to go ahead and start preparing our speaker to install on here. Now what I like to use for the speaker wires is, actually, if you look closely here, these are actually like old Athearn bulbs pretty much right here. I mean, that's literally what they are. They're bulbs. But I have a boatload of these that I've taken out of Locomotive, so it's kind of handy. I already have them laying around, and they're trash anyway, so we'll go ahead and we'll cut off the bulb end here with our well-used plier cutters here. They're pretty worn out. And so what that'll give us is two pairs of 2 wires, which is kind of nice for what we're about to do here. So what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to come in, and this end will be the end that goes to the board itself right here. So again, as we did with all the other wires, we're just going to take and burn this in with some solder and kind of melt all that insulation and try and melt all that stuff off of there. Looks like that's all starting to go together. Different wires, the insulation does different things when you put heat to it. It looks like these are kind of melting and smearing a little bit more than cooking on off of there, but that's fine. We can work with that. As long as we get that top layer off of there, we'll be good to go. And there they go. They're taking a little bit of solder on there. They're taking some solder and it's mixing with the insulation a bit, but as long as that solder gets in there and gets good contact with the wire, if there's a little insulation in there, that's not the end of the world either. It should cook off when we go to put them on the board at least. So normally that insulation, once your iron starts to get pretty hot, that'll just melt out and burn out, so sometimes you just gotta let it sit for a few minutes. There's our first end there, all soldered up. So this will be the end that goes on the board. We'll go ahead and prepare our other one here as well. This is one of those times also that you can really feel that wire getting hot, but for some reason, like doing these, when you're just burning the insulation off, the wire will get very hot, but it won't be burning hot, so keep that in mind. If you start to feel it in your fingers, don't like panic and end up hitting your finger on the wires or something. You're not going to get burned during this part holding the wire, but you will feel a little bit of heat in there. So those ends are ready, so now we need to go ahead and we need to see about what our length's going to have to be. So we'll just throw that up there and then we're going to eyeball this. So that's about where we want it. Maybe cut it down just a little bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make these both identical lengths. I don't want one to be longer or shorter or anything because they both have to go to each speaker. So all I'm going to do is just take them and put them together. And then that first one that I eyeballed about how I wanted, we'll go ahead and we'll take and we'll cut that one there. And there you have it. You end up with a lot of little bits of wires, so it's always best to try and throw them off to the back when you're working on this part here. Alright, so now we're about ready to go ahead and start soldering these on. Before we go ahead and start trying to attach them though, it really helps a lot if you take your iron and you come in and you get a little bit of solder on these little tabs here first. Hope that's showing up on the camera. You want to get a little bit on those tabs, that way when you go to put the wire on there it'll stick a little bit easier. You're not trying to solder the wire and the tab. You're not trying to get solder on both of them at the same time. If you get a little bit on there to start with, that makes all the difference. And another thing to note when you're soldering these speakers is the speaker obviously has a magnet in it, and the magnet can get stuck to the iron if you're not careful. So you guys might have a hard time seeing that, but I'm actually holding down the center of the speaker with my finger and soldering kind of off to the side of the speaker. I don't want to be over top of it too much because that's when it'll try to pick it up. Alright, so we got that on there. Let's go ahead and prepare our first set of wires here. Now these are very similar in the fact that we're going to go ahead and pretty much just strip the end off of them, put a little solder on them, and we'll attach them. Now the key thing to remember when you're doing these speaker wires is, especially when you're running a pair of dual speakers, as we are here, this pair of wires right here will go to the first terminal on each one of these, so it would be the left hand side one. Alright, and then the second one will go to the two right hand side ones. You want to make sure you keep those keep that order correct, or else you'll end up screwing something. You'll end up frying some stuff, so I at least believe you will. I can't remember. I don't think I've ever made that mistake, but just keep that in mind when you're doing these. That's also part of the reason I like to use these old sets of bulb wires, because they're already twisted together, so I can just do them two at a time, and that makes it a little bit simpler. So I'm not risking mixing up my wires at all. So we'll go ahead and let's get this first one on here. And there's really no trick with these. This is just a really small wire on a really small terminal. I'm hoping that showed up on camera because that one went too well. Let's see if I get this one to pop in here. Just set the wire up against it. Get a little bit of soldering iron action in there. And then it should solder to the side. You got to hold it for a few seconds to really let that solder dry on there. Well, let it cool off on there. That's good, and that's about what we're looking for right there. So there we go. I'll go ahead and get the second set of wires on there, and I'll go ahead and come back when we start hooking this onto the board. Alright, so now we have our wires all glued into, soldered into place here. See, we have these two, which are both front, and these two, which are both the rear ones. So they're all soldered on there, they're correctly on there. And then one little piece of advice for you guys there, you might want to move these around a little bit, make sure they're not loose. Sometimes these can break off kind of easy, so you want to be careful there if you can. That way You don't have to start falling apart the minute you go to put the shell on. You don't have those wires coming off or anything. I always like to make sure the joints are good and sturdy. So to install this on the shell, what I'm going to do, took a piece of electrical tape here. I'm just going to take it, I'm going to try and roll it up a little bit. That could be a bit of a bear to do, but so I get and roll it so it's all sticky on the outside there. Take it and put it on the bottom there like so. Normally you want it to fit wherever it's got to go, but we'll just go ahead and go with that, and then we'll take and get that to sit on there like so. And we want to put that right about right there, because I want to try and have this forward somewhat to keep it out of the wires. Alright, so we have our speaker wires soldered on. Doesn't matter which spot you put these wires to, whether it be like the front lug to one side or the rear lug to the other. Doesn't really matter, at least as far as I'm aware, the polarity that you go with there. So I normally put the front one closer to me and the rear one to the center spot there, but again, it doesn't really matter as far as I'm aware, so keep that in mind when you're doing this. So we're going to go ahead now, we're going to start sorting through all of our wires to solder them to the board here. We're going to start off first with our front lights, which I'll have to find the wire for here. Should be probably this one here, hanging off to the side. Yep, there it is. So what I like to do is normally I'll take my shell and I lay it down next to my motor and drive assembly here. And I'll pull the wires out gently. I want to rip them out of where they're taped in, but I want to kind of get them so I'll have a little bit of slack in them, but not too much. And then I'll cut them to length to what I want them to be. Go ahead. Nope, that last one's not going to want to cut, of course. Generally helps if you have a good pair of pliers for this, but I'll just keep using them old ones till they can't cut anymore. So now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my red wires. These will all actually end up bundled together in a big wad at the end and all soldered to the same spot on the board. These blue wires, on the other hand, will go to the spot that is specific for the headlight on our board here, which says BL, I believe is what that is, or yeah, I think that's BL. But first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in, I'm going to actually solder my red wires together and twist them to kind of get them out of the way and to kind of keep them a little bit neater and more organized while I do the rest of it, because these will be the last part we do here in the front will be these red wires. So get a little solder on there, kind of doesn't have to be like a real good joint. I just want this basically so that when I start twisting it, it'll roll together real nice, and the easiest way to do that, of course, is to solder it a little bit at the end and connect them. So we just take them and we just twist, and it'll kind of spins the wire all together there. But I mainly just solder them so that I could twist them, and then so too they'll kind of keep them together and keep them from being a mess of wires here when we get down the road later. Now what I will do is once I get them twisted, I'll come back in here. I'm just going to burn the end of this wire some more. Not really trying to get any solder on there so much as I'm just trying to get the end of the wire, both wires stripped out nice. Obviously, got to be a little bit careful. You can burn your fingers when you touch that wire, so just be a little bit careful. Don't, clamp down on it and go to town, but don't be too shy either if you're trying to get the wires to stick together. So that ought to do for this, at least for now, because we're still going to have to put these all together here later on down the road. I'm going to do the same thing with these two blue wires, which are for our front light again. Same process, it's just these ones we're actually going to solder to the board. Let's go ahead and we'll get a little bit of that there. Get a little going on the end. We'll set our iron down out of the way. And we'll start getting them twisted together, and this mainly just kind of neatens up your wiring a bit. You could do this before you solder it, but it's a heck of a lot bigger of a hassle, and it's a lot easier to twist them once you have the solder on them. Let's go ahead and get a little bit more on the end there. Now these ones I want to make sure I have a good solder joint on, because these are going to go right onto the board. So I'll make sure I get all that insulation off of them and that they are nicely soldered here. The main thing is to make sure that there's any insulation left. And with how hot this iron is and these particular type LEDs, the wire that comes on them, these normally strip off fairly easily. So just a little heat will clean them up nice, and there we go. So now I'm going to go ahead to my board here. I'm going to kind of push that wire out of the way. I want to solder this down to the board where it says BL here in the front. Careful not to solder one of your other wires by accident, but that's probably the trickiest part about this, is trying to keep the wires straight here early and try not to be bumping into other ones when you're trying to do different things. But just patience, patience, and patience. Normally takes about an hour for me to do all of the wiring on one of these, just to sit here and do, you know, a couple wires at a time and do it well. And 99% of the time I go to test it and there's still one light that's not working, and I got to go back and check all these joints and resolder them, try resoldering them, and a lot of times that'll fix the problem, but sometimes you'll just have one that's being stubborn and just will not work, and yeah, go all the way back through and yank it out. It's never a good time, but it happens. It's just part of the deal, you know. I'd like to say that every time it goes perfect all the time, but that's not that's not the reality of doing something like this. So now I gotta sort through my wires again here and find my front ditch lights, because those are what we're gonna do next. That's rear light, that's rear ditch light. These are marker. So where is front ditch light at? There it is. Down here hidden off the camera. That's why I couldn't find it. Let's see if I can get this untangled from these other wires. There we go. Sometimes these wires will all hang out on one side like this. It can be a bit frustrating, but let's see if we can get some of these to kind of get out of the way here. Oh, that one's hung up on the horn. Alright, no, that's not great, but that's better. I'll take it. I'll take it. Beggars can't be choosers. Let's go ahead and we're going to cut this one down here. Bump the camera, of course, because this isn't a professional video. This is just a demonstrational one. Let's go ahead and cut all those. There we go. Set that off to the side. And same process. Well, this isn't exactly the same process. It's a little different here with these ditch lights, because we're going to have flashing ditch lights on this. If you were going to have non-flashing ditch lights, you would just solder the two blue wires together. But with this, the blue wires will be staying separate. The red wires will be put together. So the red wires, the same as the last time, we're going to get a little solder on them, get them started, and we're going to twist them up and get them nice and neat so they'll stay out of the way for us. If we can. Sometimes they don't like to do that. We're getting a little twist in there. There we go. That's better. Okay, so we got that one done. And now we just have our two separate blue wires. Now these will get marked, put down to the spots that say 1 and 2, because those are what I have programmed to be both front ditch lights or auxiliaries 1 and 2 on my decoder. So we'll just go ahead and get the end of this burnt up a little bit here. Okay, I notice you'll get a little bit of solder chunked up on there. You just want to make sure that you can tell that you got all that insulation off of it. There we go. That's a clean wire. So now we'll come in and go ahead and we'll put this one on number 1, like so. Once the iron gets good and hot, normally you touch those pads, they'll melt pretty quick, so don't have to sit there and hold it. If your iron isn't hot enough, you'll run into where you'll be putting the iron on there and the solder won't melt. So It normally means the iron isn't hot enough. Ooh, I just realized I made a mistake, everybody. We're going to have to catch this one. This is a big one. I just realized my front headlights, I put those in the wrong spot. It's been a while since I've wired one of these, so we're going to yank these off. Because actually, they don't go to the blue. The blue, the BL is what that says. That's actually for all your red wires. Oh, I thought something was funny with that. I'm like, what? Something doesn't seem right about that. Here we go. It says forward right on the board, but you know, sometimes when you're a bit tired, you read things funny and you make mistakes. At least we caught that now. Well, it's a shame I'm not going to be able to refilm that part there, but oh well. If I can just get this wire to go down there now. And nope. Get out of here, that dang wire. Alright, nope. The trickiest part can be getting that wire to sit in there at that right angle. Just to go in there and go to where it's got to go there. Just can't get it at that right spot to where it's going to solder into place. There we go. This should be it right here. Oh yeah, see, now we're talking. That's in there. Okay. So to recap here, the blue is at the BL, where it says BL. That is actually all the red wires. And I think it actually stands for black now that I'm thinking about it. But, yeah, you know, I'm a little bit tired. I apologize. Not on my A game today, but we're going to try and get some more of this done. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go off camera here, and I'm going to do the rear ditch lights and the rear headlights. Then I'll come back and show you that when we start into the number boards and marker lights. Alright, so we've got all our rear ditch light wires soldered down to their places, as well as our rear headlight wires. We have our red wires all wired together now as well. So our next move here is going to be to do our number board lights. Now for the number board lights, these will go on auxiliary 5, which is over here on our board right below 6. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this will be, well, we got 6 wires here, I believe. So I'm going to start off by, I want to take both from front and rear. I'm going to hold them together like this and kind of get the wires all similar length here, and then I'm going to cut them. Hopefully cut them all in one go here without having to... Yep. Last one's just not wanting to cut. Okay. Yep. It's always one that just doesn't want to do what it's got to do. I want to get that end off of that. I don't like that little bent spot there. Don't want that. That's no good. There we go. Alright, so for these number boards, going to be a little bit different than the way we did the ditch lights in that. For our red wires, we're going to pretty much separate. We're going to do the 2 in the front are going to go with our wad of red wires from the front. And our 1 wire from the rear that does our rear number boards will go with the ones for the rear. Let's see if I can adjust that camera up a little bit. I might have knocked it down here. There we go. So we'll go ahead and we're going to get a little solder on that. Twist that all up. So that way it's somewhat neater than it was. Oh, that's a good bit longer than the other one. That might be too long. Yeah, you know what? I'm thinking that's a little bit too long there. Let's cut that down. Cut that up a bit. Because I don't want it overhanging those that much. If it was a little bit long, I could live with it, but not an inch too long. We're going to trim that down. Now, of course, now this isn't going to want to cut, because... Oh, there we go. Alright, back to what we were doing here. So we got these together here. I'll have to solder this red one a bit. Burn that end we just cut off. Get that all nice and stripped. Now for the fun part, trying to get it to stick to our other 4 red wires from the front there. This is where it gets to be a bit tricky to get all these wires to start sticking together really well, because you're kind of... I don't want to mess with that one, but Just gotta get a good, ooh, there we go. That ought to hold them. And twist those together. We gotta do the same thing with the single wire from the rear, but it's a little bit easier because it's just a single wire instead of 2 wires. We'll just burn the end off of it. And this one, that'll twist down in there. I don't need to trim that one. Go ahead and just get a little joint going on there. And then we twist it in with the rest of them. So now so there's our front and rear. And these will get soldered down to the ones that say BL, which does stand for black. I recall it actually is black is the correct label for that. It's been quite a while since I've done one of these builds, and I think the last one I did I actually used a decoder buddy for as opposed to the Keep Alive board, but that's because I was using a newer ESU style decoder and the V5 version. This one is actually getting I think it's a select. It's either a select or a V4, so you don't have to have the separate Keep Alive like you have to have on the V5 Loc sound decoders. So this one, these V4s and the selects, I prefer to use the TCS board with the built-in Keep Alive, as opposed to having to go through getting a board from Decoder Buddy and then adding the ESU decoder, or the ESU Keep Alive to it. It's a lot more than I want to be doing. I'd rather just get all one unit. Now, I believe ESU actually just came out with this last year a built-in, like a direct style one that actually has a built-in Keep Alive, which I'm quite interested in checking out. I'm gonna have to see if I can get my hands on one of those when they come available, but we'll see how that goes. Because I'd really be intrigued by that. Although the Decoder Buddy boards are actually, I like how you can separate them from the shell, so that's kind of nice too. You could separate you could have that little separate piece that goes to all the wires on the shell that plugs into the board. That is nice for working on things, but the little pads on there are a little bit difficult to solder to. But there we go. There's our number board soldered to our number 5 spot there. And that leaves us with our marker lights. This will be the last set of lights we're going to have to solder on here. Also be probably more the most challenging ones here, because these are a different brand of LED. And these can be a little bit more of a pain in the rear end to get the solder to stick to and all that. I don't know what it is about this type of wire that's on these, but it just does not, the insulation does not like to come off very well, and these will fight me tooth and nail every time. So strap on in, everybody, and prepare for this, because these will be a bit of a hassle. They never like to solder well. So we're going to go ahead, and what I'm going to do is these already come pre-stripped on the end. I'm just going to solder that together to start with, and see if maybe we can work with that if they're not too long. I really don't want them to be overly long either, but trying to get this installation to strip off of these with a soldering iron never seems to work too well. It always seems to be a hassle. It's definitely not the same kind of wire that's on the other ones, so go ahead and we'll get a little bit going on there. Those two are pretty good together. I'm kind of liking it. I think I got a good feeling about that. That looks pretty nice. That might just work. We'll have to see there. And then we'll go ahead and we'll do our 2 black ones from the rear here as well. Then we gotta try and solder all 4 of them together, which is, oh, it's a bear, but I'm hoping these will go together decent, because I'm filming this and it won't be the usual hassle I get into with these, but we'll see. I think the last one I did, oddly enough, all the lights worked on the first try, which was kind of bizarre, because I've probably done 30 or 40 locomotives now that I've done all these lights on, and there's always, it's either a number board or a ditch light, or one of the 2 headlights won't work, or you run into trouble with these marker lights from time to time just because of this damn wire that doesn't like to strip. So Let's see if maybe we can get it right on one try this time. If not, I'll get to show you guys how to fix that, and it'll actually probably be a better video anyway for a how-to series. So there's that one. Where'd that other one go? Where'd that devil go? Okay, there we go. We'll go ahead and we'll take these two, and we'll 2 sets of 2. We're going to solder them together. Hopefully these will all stick together. I'm hoping. If not, well, we're going to keep going until they do. But those don't want to stay out. There we go. Those are out of the way now. Sometimes you can get lucky and the insulation will kind of melt together and help hold them. Those are actually good. Nice. Start the twist deal. These wires also don't twist up as well together in a grouping either. But until the place I get my other LEDs from starts selling these red ones as well, I'm kind of stuck with what I got. So I'm sure if you guys got a decent place to get these pre-wired LEDs from, drop it in the comments below, because I could certainly use a place to get the red ones from where the insulation won't be fighting me like these do. Now what I'm going to do here is, I got this all soldered together, but it's a bit bigger than I want it to be, so I want to kind of come in here and try and cut this down a little bit and make it a bit smaller. And then I'm going to take and I want to solder the end of this just a little bit, just to try and hopefully all this will hold together. If not, this will be where we run into trouble, is this joint won't be all the way good enough, and it looks pretty good. We'll give it a shot. Worst case, we got to pull it back out and mess with it again. We'll pull it back out and mess with it again. Now this is where the soldering gets to be a bit tricky, because as you can tell, we're really starting to get a lot of wires attached to the board. There's not really a lot of room to work. You don't want everything touching anything else. Yeah, there we go. That's on there. Alright, now for the last part here, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to take these red wires, I'm going to put them with these red wires, and I'm going to solder them to the spot on the board that says BL, and I'll come back to you when we're going to go test this thing. So let me get that done. I'll be right back. Alright, so we've got our red wires all installed here now. Soldered them up pretty dang good there. So the last thing to do here before we go test it is we're going to take our 21 pin decoder and we're going to install it here on our board. And then we'll very carefully put our shell on. I wanted to show this because you gotta be kind of careful folding all the wires in there and putting the shell on. But first thing we're gonna do here, we're gonna take our decoder. We're just gonna carefully pick up our wires. They should be soldered on there well, but I don't want to find out the hard way that I got a loose solder joint when I go to move these here. But normally I always like to wait to put the board on, because you're working in such a small space. It really, every little bit of room you got helps. So got our board on there. Now the technique for putting this shell back in here, so we got all our wires, we want all these in the middle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over. And I'm going to just kind of carefully, what I want to do is I want to fold these wires towards the middle more. That way they get kind of pressed into that center section as we put our shell down there. And what I'll do is I'll come over here and make sure there's nothing hanging up in there and that it's all going down where it should be. And normally it'll just fall right down in there like so and click into place like that just did, which is beautiful. So now we're going to have to head on over to the layout and test out our wiring job and make sure everything's good to go. So I'll see you at the layout. Alright, so we have our shell back on. We have all our wiring done. Let's go ahead and give this a test now. Let's go ahead and put on our front light, our front ditch lights, and our marker lights. We got everything up there. We'll throw the sound to it. We'll come around here to the back and do the same. You can see there's all our lights working in the back as well. Ditch lights are flashing. And we're looking good, so we can go head back to the workbench now and we will go ahead and start doing all the reassembly work.